Hey guys, welcome back to Andy's Dinosaur Reviews, and today we've got ourselves another brand new 2025 Schleich release. We finally have the Megalodon. It has officially released. I actually scored this one on Amazon. I'm not entirely sure how long it's been out. It might be a little while actually, but it only just hit Amazon, so pretty happy to now have it. One thing I will say about the figure straight out of the gate is it's pretty darn big. I was not expecting it to be quite as large as it is. Of course, it is a Megalodon, so I should have expected it to be fairly large, but definitely impressive when it comes to its overall size. It is definitely a very sizable Megalodon, probably one of the larger ones that I have. So when it comes to a nice closer look, we're going to begin here in the head sculpt, and you can see the head sculpt does look pretty decent. Not incredible, but decent enough. You've got a nice light tone of color here for the lower half of our Megalodon, or at least as far as the front part of the figure goes. And then we have a grayish tone as you move up here into the upper half of the Megalodon. We can see the eyes are sculpted pretty nicely, painted with a nice glossy black. We can also see the nostrils. We do have tons of injuries and scars throughout the course of the figure, but they don't really look that great. They look kind of generic when it comes to the way that they painted them, because they basically took like a black and then ran it through. In some areas they kind of even like just almost looks like they took a fine point, or not even necessarily a fine point, but like a marker, and just sort of like kind of traced out the scars and injuries, and not even nicely. You can see some areas don't even have the paint running the entire way through, so not a big fan of that. They did the same thing as you move down into the gills, and again, it does look really quite sloppy and not very Schleich-like when it comes to that paintwork. But the mouth is sculpted in an open position, so one thing that is at least decent is the inside of the mouth. Again, looks pretty good. You've got a nice dark tone as you move further back into the mouth. You can also see an opening here in the throat, and I'm actually not entirely sure why it has that opening. I don't know if maybe you're supposed to like put water in this or what. I wasn't paying that much attention to any information on it prior to this, but there is like an opening right there in the throat. But we can see the teeth are all decent looking. They're not, you know, super sharp looking or incredible by any means, but they look all right. There's a little bit of sloppiness to the paintwork on the inside of the mouth, but not too bad. I also like the fact that we have some variation of color as you move through the outer area of like the gums and everything. You could see like a red, and then maybe like a little dry brushing, or maybe it was like a pink and then they applied a red wash. I'm not entirely sure, but again, it is nice to see that variation of color. And we've got tons of teeth here on the inside of the mouth of the Megalodon. As you move up, though, you do have a whole bunch of speckles on the snout, which I think don't really look that great. And there's also some gray stripes that move through the front of the snout as well. And again, that paintwork also looks pretty sloppy, which is unfortunate. As you move back into the shark, you can see for the most part there's like zero texturing to it, and you don't expect a whole lot when it comes to a shark because you would expect it to be fairly smooth. But I've seen so many other companies create sharks that still had some slight texturing, making them just look a lot more realistic and lifelike, and even maybe a little variation of color, like just some really subtle slight changes in the grays or something really would have helped to amp up the realism, I think, of the figure. But unfortunately, they've chosen to just give it that one solid grayish tone, and again, very sloppily outline all of the injuries and scars, making the paint job somehow look even worse. As you move up, though, you can see the dorsal fin looks fairly decent. There's even like a few kind of chunks and stuff taken out of it, adding some realism to the figure. You see the same thing as you move down here into the side. Again, checking out these fins. I do like the fact that there is, even though it's, again, a little sloppy, as actually there's a little chip of paint it looks like on the end. I don't think the other one is like that. A little bit. But there is like a black tip to the undersides of the fins. The other ones back here don't have it, but I did see it here on these ones. I actually think it would have looked nice if they had put that on the top as well, but like they chose only the underside. But as you move back, again, you've got the fins back here, again painted with the grayish tone. We've of course got the white continuing to follow along the underside. You can see the underside of the figure looks fairly decent as well. And then as we lead out, again, we've got the tail fin, which pretty much has that same sort of jagged edge to it, again looking like it does have some slight injuries. Nice little curve to the tail as you lead out, and in general a nice curve to the entire body. You can see a really slight seam moving along the top right there that does actually follow the entire way through all the way out into the tail. I should have just taken that tag off. I don't know. I always leave them on and then regret it when I'm in the middle of the review. But as you move over here, again, you see pretty much the same thing as far as the grays, as far as the white here for the underside. Same deal as far as the very ugly paintwork for the injuries and scars. And again, a serious lack of depth when it comes to the actual paintwork of the figure. And I'm used to Schleich doing at least a fairly decent job when it comes to the paint apps of their figures, so I must say I am somewhat surprised to see this one looking fairly lackluster overall. But of course, again, it is a fairly big figure, which is at least one nice aspect to it. So for a size, lengthwise, you are looking at about 11¼ inches or around 28½ centimeters. For the height, you are looking at, to the top of the dorsal fin, a little bit under 4½ inches or just shy of 11½ centimeters. For a size comparison, there is Mr. Papo T-Rex, the Attack Pack Colovosaurus, Robert Muldoon in the Collect A human being next to our Schleich Megalodon, and you can see again it's definitely quite large, no doubt about that. Still, like I said, one of the bigger ones, but not the biggest. I think the biggest Megalodon I have would probably be the old PNSO vinyl version, but this one is definitely quite nicely sized, and you can very easily see that here next to all of these other figures. And then for just a few randoms, we have the Collect A Deluxe Dimetrodon, obviously a bit smaller. The Schleich Diabloceratops, which was definitely going to be a good bit smaller. The Safari Ltd Eutyrannus, which again is quite a bit smaller. And then, of course, a Mattel Velociraptor, which I often bring in for comparisons. Again, quite a bit smaller. Then when it comes to just a few Megalodon comparisons, here we have the smaller PNSO version, which is obviously a good bit smaller, as well as the larger vinyl version from PNSO that I mentioned just a little bit earlier, clearly a bit larger than the Schleich version. And you can see, again, what I'm talking about as far as like realism. Look at the way that PNSO painted theirs. There's just so much more depth to the paint job, whereas the paint job on the Schleich version is very, very childish overall. Now, of course, I know these figures are made, for adult collectors, but they do focus a strong amount on kids and, a younger collector fan base. So, I guess they don't have to put as much effort into them as they probably should, but I still think it would have looked a little bit nicer had they just made it a bit more realistic. And then we've also got the Papo Megalodon as well, which you can very clearly see is a good bit smaller than this much larger Schleich release. So this brand new Schleich Megalodon figure is okay-ish. Like, visually, it does look really cool. I was very impressed with the size. When I first pulled it out of the packaging, I was quite impressed overall with the size, but the actual realism of the figure is where they really lose me, because it almost looks like, looking at it, it looks like an animated version of a Megalodon rather than a more realistic lifelike version. And they definitely took some cues, it looks like, from Papo's version, because Papo had a very scarred up version of a Megalodon, and clearly Schleich chose to do the same thing with theirs, but they didn't do it nearly as effectively as Papo did. They really did a bad job as far as that goes, because all of the injuries and scars and everything on this are just like painted out so poorly and sloppily and just so childish that they really do not look legitimate in any way, shape, or form. And I would say the entire paint application as a whole does not look very good. It looks okay for what it is, but like, it doesn't look lifelike. Nothing about this figure outside of the mouth area has a lifelike look, if you ask me. The sculpt does have a fairly fun pose with like a nice movement of it swimming and the mouth wide open, but that's also a very common pose for a Megalodon, so I'm not too surprised to see that sort of a, visual occurring with this figure. But it is still pretty fun to have a Megalodon in the lineup from Schleich. It's just sad that it didn't turn out nearly as nice as I was hoping. Also, I did state earlier that I think the larger vinyl PNSO Megalodon is my largest Megalodon. That was a total error on my part. I forgot completely about the iToy and W Dragon versions, which are really huge. So obviously there are larger versions out there, but this is still a fairly sizable one, just not really that great as a whole. If you are interested in it though, I will include a link in the description to where you can purchase it on Amazon.com, because that's where I purchased mine. So check that link right grab it if you want it, and like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you in the next review. Thanks for watching.